All right, guys, we're back to the second round of the Unit 3 screencasts. This is the screencast on colonial reaction to British policies. And one of the biggest reactions came from a group called the Sons of Liberty. They were founded in the summer of 1765, mostly in Boston, Massachusetts. And one of the key leaders was a man named Samuel Adams, who you see here. They worked very closely with another group called the Daughters of Liberty. Now, what the Daughters did was they helped the boycott process by sewing and weaving needed materials, cooking, baking, doing anything they could to offset supplies that they were boycotting from England as a result of the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act and the Quartering Act. Now, the Sons of Liberty, they had a much more vocal aspect, a much more vocal protest to this. They were the ones that were doing a lot of the tarring and feathering, the marches through the streets, and they will be the ones, when it comes down to it, who are involved in the Boston Massacre, involved in the Boston Tea Party, and all the other very, I would say, violent protests in the American Revolution. Now, another round of acts after the Sugar Act and Stamp Act are all repealed took place with something called the Townshend Acts, named for the King's finance minister, Charles Townshend. Now, again, all these acts were raised with one purpose, and that was to make money, raise revenue. But it also punished many different colonies like New York. It suspended New York's assembly in response to the Stamp Act Congress, which I hope you had looked up and found information on because you are going to be tested on it. It also placed duties on import taxes on all materials brought into the colonies. Didn't matter where, no matter what was being brought into the colonies, they had to pay extra money. British officers, soldiers, were given what's called a writ of assistance. It was pretty much a blanket search warrant, which allowed them to enforce the laws by allowing them to go into any business, any home, and search for contraband or materials that had not been paid for, which is just wrong. It's unconstitutional by our standards, but by then it wasn't fair. They had no duty for just cause. They could just walk into anyone's home and go through your belongings looking for contraband, essentially. Anything that came into the country without that stamp, that tax. And as you would imagine, protests and rebellion continued throughout the colonies. They kept on calling out that Parliament didn't have the right to impose these taxes, and it came down to the fact that they had no representation in Congress. James Otis, a Boston lawyer, as you see here on the right, was credited with coining the term taxation without representation is tyranny. So opposing taxes without a representative for the colonies in Congress is an abuse of power, essentially what they're saying. As a result of this, most colonies formed what's called a committee of correspondence. And these were committees that communicated with each other through letters about political events, organizing ideas. And these committees would become instrumental in setting up and establishing the First Continental Congress when it comes to that time. Eventually, the Townshend Acts are repealed due to these protests and the rebellion, but things aren't fully right. We're going to fast forward a little bit to March 5th, 1770. And tensions have been growing a lot in Boston, Massachusetts. Soldiers were stealing colonist jobs, especially on the docks. They were making fun of each other. The colonists were calling the British regulars lobsterbacks because of the red jacket that they wore. The regulars were calling the colonists Yankee Doodles, which, believe it or not, was a huge insult at the time. But things really boiled over on March 5th, 1770, when at night, the British soldiers, about 12 of them, opened fire on a mob of British colonists. English colonists, Boston colonists, killing 5 men, including a freed slave named Crispus Attucks. Now, in your document analysis, you are going to be analyzing information about this massacre, and I use that term loosely. John Adams, future president, served as the lawyer representing the redcoats that were on trial for murder. Here is one of those images that you guys might be analyzing. Now this, if you look closely at it, the bottom right-hand corner, right down here, it says that the this image was engraved and sold by Paul Revere himself, which slight conflict of interest, especially considering he was not there. Or was he? A couple of things I want you to draw attention to. The position of the British officer. He's standing in the back, has his sword raised, as if you can almost hear him giving the order to fire. Look at the colonists over here. Many of them seem to be wealthy, with nice clothes, and they seem very peaceful, just a bunch of people out on a typical afternoon day, because you see it's blue sky over here. But another thing you need to notice is there is a moon out, because the Boston Massacre actually happened at night. The last thing I want you to recognize is the dog. There's a dog right down here on the bottom showing that this just up and happened. Typically, a dog would not hang out if there was a violent fight going on, but the dog is just sitting there as if nothing was going on. Now I want to show you another image of that same event. Very different. We see here colonists have clubs in their hands. We see multiple clubs. There's another one on the floor here, one in the air, a couple of rocks being thrown. Now, over here, we see the British officer. We can know he's the officer because he has the sword in his hand. He is in front of his soldiers, which is a huge deal because what officer would stand in front of his men and give the order to fire? Contradicting the last image made by Paul Revere. Another thing I want to draw attention to is this man right here. This is Crispus Attucks. Remarkably, he's missing from the last picture. He is nowhere to be seen here. Now, we will talk in class about why this change was made in the Revere engraving, whereas this one is slightly different. Well, and by slightly, I mean drastically different. The other thing I want you to notice is there are more British soldiers here, almost back to back, like they were surrounded. Ultimately, no matter who threw the first punch as it would be, or caused the British soldiers to fire, 5 men did die that day. Samuel Gray, Samuel Maverick, James Caldwell, Crispus Attucks, and Patrick Carr, all 5 of those men died that day. Another thing that people don't realize is that there was somebody else who died for this revolutionary cause a few days earlier. See on the gravestone, his name is Christopher Snyder, 12 years old. He was killed just a few days earlier by a British loyalist who thought he was a Boston patriot and kind of put his nose where it didn't belong. They call him the first martyr, the first blood spilt of the American Revolution. There's just a closer view of the Boston Massacre tomb, which is in the Granary Burial Ground in Boston, Massachusetts. Things had calmed down for quite some time, 3 years. Things had quieted down. There was still tension, there was still argument, but nothing violent. England repealed all taxes except for one, the tea tax. And, well, you don't mess with British subjects and their tea. So in 1773, the Tea Act was published, which gave England total control, essentially a monopoly on colonial tea. They could not import it from anywhere else unless it was brought in through the English Tea Company. Sam Adams got the Sons of Liberty mobilized. Sam, along with his friends Paul Revere, John Hancock, got things going, and they dressed up like Mohawk natives. They snuck on board 3 different British tea ships on December 16, 1773. They smashed every single tea chest and threw it all into Boston Harbor, destroying millions of dollars worth of tea. The king was furious, understandably. As a result, he passed something called the Coercive Acts. Colonists had another word for it, the Intolerable Acts. What this did is it blockaded Boston Harbor until all the tea was paid for, which, according to the colonists, wasn't going to happen. It forbade committees of correspondence. They were not allowed to meet, but they met anyway. British troops were allowed to be housed anywhere they chose. This reinstated the Quartering Act, and then some. Now colonists were getting kicked out of their homes thanks to the British troops. any British official that was accused of a crime had to be tried in England, which really meant that if a British official or a British soldier was accused of a crime in the colonies, they would go back to England and have some time off and be found innocent of all charges because, well, we were the colonists and we were just causing trouble. The last thing that the Coercive Acts did was it gave total control of the Massachusetts Bay Colony to a man named General Thomas Gage. Now, all accounts, Gage tried to be reasonable, but then again, these were not exactly reasonable times. And things just went downhill from here. Because of all this, because of the Coercive Acts, the First Continental was called in Philadelphia in September 1774. Now, all colonies except for Georgia sent representatives to Philadelphia. Why not Georgia? Well, for one, it was a long trip from Georgia to Philadelphia, but also most of Georgia, as you know, is a penal colony and a military facility. So most of the people there either weren't as interested, or they were soldiers, or they were at least sympathizers, which we call loyalists. This First Continental Congress did two very important things. Number one, it voted to stop all trade with England. Secondly, it asked each colony to form a militia and start stockpiling weapons. Now, General Gage learns of this, and he finds out that Boston, Massachusetts colonists were stockpiling weapons in a barn outside of Concord, Massachusetts. The colonists find out that Gage learns of this, and they send word to move the weapons because Gage is going to confiscate them. Paul Revere and William Dawes are asked to carry the message out of Boston and spread the word to at least 40 other riders throughout the Massachusetts countryside. And that happened on the night of April 18th, 1775. This becomes known as the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, but in reality, there were over 40 riders. Now, both Revere and Dawes make it to Lexington, Massachusetts, where they alert the Lexington militia, and they meet up with a man named Dr. Samuel Prescott. Now, the three of them move on from Lexington on to Concord, but they meet up with a group of British soldiers. They scatter. Revere is captured. Dawes is thrown from his horse and breaks his arm. Prescott is able to get away from the British troops, and he alone is able to make it on to Concord. As the night goes on, Revere is able to escape from his British captors. We'll explain why and how he's able to escape later on. But after he leaves, he goes to the home of John Hancock, or at least the family home of John Hancock, where he and Samuel Adams are hiding out. There, he's able to sneak them out of Massachusetts because there's actually an arrest warrant for both of them. The British had learned of their involvement in the Boston Tea Party and other aspects of the Sons of Liberty, and there's an arrest warrant issued for both of them. Revere is able to sneak them out of Massachusetts and get them down to Philadelphia for the second meeting of the Continental Congress. Now, Paul Revere, in our history, is a huge influence. But the coppersmith, the silversmith, really only had a very minor role up until this point. And that whole Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, as famous as it is, he was only one of 40 riders that night. He just happened to be the first one to go, he and William Dawes. Yet Revere is the one that gets all the credit. So after this night, the war is going to start, and we'll look much more in depth at it, which is part of the reason why Revere is able to escape. Gunshots erupt in the morning, early hours of the morning, in the city of Lexington. British soldiers hear it. They know they have an unarmed guy who had broken curfew, but obviously he was not the one firing muskets. So he's released, and that's how he's able to make it back to Hancock's house and guide Hancock and Adams out of the city. Remember, guys, you're going to be going back through and doing another cause and effect flowchart. You've got a lot more effects to go through, a lot more causes and effects. So good luck, and let us know if you have any problems.